You want to know how we lift a building? Well, I'll tell you. It's very simple. We lift a building very carefully.
We're coming.
Number one's tightening up. Watch your gauge. We got an oil leak. We got a leak. Shut down. Shut everything down.
All right, everybody shut off right now. All jacks, shut off.
The engineering art of Pete Friesen, the mind, heart, and soul that moves man-made mountains. Pete Friesen, the brilliant engineer and artist who designed the equipment and directed the most famous mega moves of the 20th century. Without the equipment Pete designed, without the creative engineering mind Pete has been blessed with, many of America's great historic buildings would have been destroyed. It is Pete's unified hydraulic jacking system that makes the moving of these delicate historic structures look as though children are playing with Lego or Meccano sets, driving them down streets in any direction they wish to go. Buildings weighing up to 14 million pounds. Buildings preserved for us and our children. The beautiful Lafayette, Indiana train station. The magnificent Schubert and Gem theaters. Nauset, Highland, Block Island, and Cape Hatteras lighthouses. The beautiful marble Newark, New Jersey air terminal. The oldest academy in Idaho. A turn-of-the-century fire station, all safely moved under the direction of Pete Friesen and now preserved for our enjoyment. Pete is the acknowledged top structural mover in the world. DeLon Hampton, president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, invited Pete to receive his Projects Opal Award for moving Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, and wrote, "No gathering of engineering's brightest and best would be complete without you, Pete Friesen." When considering the fact that Pete's only formal education went as far as grade 8, Pete's fantastic achievements deserve further explanation. Pete's young spirit speaks through our host, Dominic Louis.
This is Pete Friesen. Pete's 83 years old, and his spirit wants me to tell the story of his life. You know how when grown-up men talk about how they're really grown-up kids? I don't know how many grown-up men really are grown-up kids, but I know Pete's a grown-up kid, because I've talked to him, and I understand him, and he understands me. I think you'll understand Pete. So here's Pete's story from what I know. Pete was born in southern Russia in the Ukraine in 1922. The Ukraine is grain farming country, and Pete's mom and dad are Mennonite farmers. Mennonites are religious people, just like a lot of other religious people. Only one thing is different about the Mennonites. They won't fight. They won't shoot people or hurt people. They follow the rules in the Bible, and they believe that God wrote the Bible, and the Bible says you shouldn't kill. Most religious people who say they believe in the Bible kill people anyway. Not the Mennonites. They believe that if someone wants to kill you, but knows you won't fight back, then maybe they'll leave you alone. Mennonites are not cowards because they won't fight. They will go to the front lines of combat to care for wounded soldiers. Many of them were killed this way during wars. They just wouldn't carry weapons. Pete was raised by these Mennonites. In 1917, 5 years before Pete was born, Dietrich Friesen was very rich. He had 30 servants and laborers working for him. He had lots of land, horses and cattle, a beautiful wife, and 2 young sons. The Ukraine was part of Russia in 1917, and under Russian rule, everything was peaceful. Russia was rich. The problem was, only a few people had all the money. Most of the people were poor. The peasants, people who worked on the land for the rich people, had very little food. Many people were starving. Pete says this has been going on for most of our human history, and the only way to stop it is to take care of the poor. That is the measure of a healthy society. Well, by that measure, in 1917, Russia was not a healthy society. The Mennonites were living peacefully on their land, and they were rich. Dietrich Friesen and his family had many servants and laborers working for them. And when the revolution started, the peasants and the bandit named Moknov killed, raped, and plundered their way through the Mennonite communities.
I remember Father talking about how I treated the servants and so forth, and they were not very nice to the servants there. It reminded me of the way we treated our slaves in the South.
But some of the communities were spared the worst of the horrible actions by the peasants and the Moknov bandits. The Mennonite communities and farmers who had been kind to the servants and workers before the revolution started were treated more kindly by these new revolutionaries. Dietrich had not treated his servants very kindly. Although Pete was not yet born, the stage was being set for him by his father, Dietrich.
Some of Dad's servants came back to get him, and they had dogs, and he'd hear the dogs barking. So he and my oldest brother would hop out the window and hide in the cornfield someplace. They figured they wouldn't hurt the women. They came in the first time, and they didn't hurt the women. They came in the second time, and they killed his wife, his mother, a sister. There were a number of people that got killed. His son. Shortly thereafter, Dad left the estate.
After a few years between running and hiding from the Moknov bandit gang and the peasants, Dietrich married Anna, one of the Mennonite servants who had worked in his household. A year later, Peter Friesen was born. There was still a lot of fighting going on, so Dietrich, with the help of other Mennonites, decided to try and escape Russia. So they got on a train and went to Moscow, and from there, traveled over 400 miles to the port city of Riga. It was a very hard journey. Sailed to Southampton, England, and from there, across the stormy North Atlantic Ocean. During the voyage, one-year-old baby Pete cried so much that they wanted to throw him overboard. Of course, Dietrich was only joking, but it was a sick joke, and showed an attitude he had toward Pete. An attitude that signaled a stormy life ahead for Pete as he grew up. Pete, his half-brother Jake, his father Dietrich, and his mother Anna were quarantined in St. John for 3 months before they could move on to their final destination in Provost, Alberta, in the Canadian West. Across the river in St. John was a baby girl called Edith. While he was in quarantine, Pete was only a few hundred yards away from his future wife in this strange new land. Of course, no one knew this at the time. But Pete would come back and meet this girl as the result of another war that would occur in less than 17 years. World War II. Dietrich bought a farm close to Provost, Alberta, with 480 acres of fertile soil and a beautiful house. Dietrich was very proud of his new farm and house. He was not proud that he had to work on it himself. He did not like to shovel cow manure. He did not like to work in the grain fields. He was an aristocrat in Russia, and that's what he wanted to be here in North America. Now, Dietrich was doing what his servants used to do for him back in Russia. Hard labor.
Mom tells that Dad had to start working there, stooking grain and so forth. The sheaves put him up, and Dad had never done a hand's turn of work in his life.
This made Dietrich very angry. And he turned his anger onto little Pete. See, Dietrich was still in love with his first wife, Aganitha, who had been killed during the revolution. And he still dreamed he could go back to Russia and make things like they used to be, riding around in fancy carriages with servants doing all the work. Well, now Dietrich was working like his servants used to work for him back in Russia. On top of that, his wife Anna was his servant in Russia, and his son Pete was her son, the son of a servant. One bitterly cold day when Pete was only 4 and had just come in from outside and was warming up by the kitchen stove,
Take your hat off.
Why? You're fine. Dad hit me so hard.
You must learn to obey your father.
If he had been a strong man, like a working man, he'd have killed me.
a 5-year-old's hands are very small, and it's almost impossible to wrap those little fingers around a cow's teats. Milking is very hard work for grown-ups, let alone a 5-year-old boy. But Dietrich forced Pete, at that age, to start milking the cows. Pete's hands and forearms ached and ached, and he used to moan with pain. His hands and forearms were getting stronger, and the pain from milking was being replaced with strength and endurance. Pete started school when he was 7. Up till then, he had only associated with other Mennonites, understood the Mennonite culture, and spoke the German language. The Mennonite school he thought he would be going to was only a short distance away from his home. The problem was, the school district boundary line ran a few yards from his home. This meant that he would have to go to Rosenheim's Catholic school, 4 miles away, even though the Mennonite school was closer. The officials insisted that he go to Rosenheim Catholic school. So on his first day of school, instead of being surrounded by Mennonite kids, he was surrounded by Catholic children, calling him names for no reason whatsoever except that their parents taught them to. These Catholic children did not like Mennonites. Pete used the only English words he knew when his teacher asked him his name. Tom Tinker had a dog. It said bow wow. Pete immediately became a mark for the school bullies and was beaten almost every day, had his front teeth knocked out, and was a favorite target for the 6-month snowball season in cold Provost, Alberta. Pete dodged most of the snowballs, for he was fast, although small for his age. And he was very strong from his hours of hard work, and he started to defend himself. Pete would not be bullied forever, though, for he soon became one of the top students in the school, the best speller, and excelled in mathematics. Then, a strange thing happened to Pete when he was only 7. The windmill Dietrich had on the farm was about 35 feet tall, or 3.5 stories high. The windmill pumped water from the well as the propellers spun in the wind. It broke down, and there was nobody around to fix it. Now Pete would have to pump water by hand. Even if his father came back, Dietrich was afraid to climb to the top and fix it. And his Uncle Peter, who always fixed it, was away for at least a week. Pete did not want to have to pump water by hand for a week, so he decided to fix it himself. He found a new part to replace the one on top and began to climb up the outside of the steel truss framework until he reached the small wooden platform near the top. The platform hung out past the steel frame, so, holding on to the spare part, he tried to lean out into space and crawl on top. He slipped and fell, but grabbed onto a truss with his free hand and dangled there like a rag doll in the prairie wind, 3.5 stories above the ground. There was no point in calling out for help. His one hand was very strong for milking cows for the last 2 years, and he knew he would have no trouble hanging on. He swung his feet back onto the main structure and climbed up where the wooden platform didn't hang out. He crawled on top and sat down.
And as I sat with my hands around my knees and my head between my knees and thinking, I said, "You dumbhead, you dumb cop, you have found a different way if you only thought, you imagined, if you'd only thought." And as I thought a little farther about it, what dumb thing did I do when I climbed up? And so inch by inch, I laid out every hand movement and where the part would be, how I would open the gate. I did all that, and the windmill got the part in there, and it was operating. And I had an imagination to start with. I thought it through. Der Stenche. And another way that we say today, visualize.
He'd climbed up the windmill as an immature boy, aimlessly, carelessly. He climbed down as a mature young boy, with a sense of purpose and personal direction. He did not know it yet, but this experience would guide Pete for the rest of his life. to become the very best in the whole world at his chosen profession. At Rosenheim School, things started to change. Pete started to fight back, and he was very strong. Soon, the bullying died down, and by the end of grade 7, he was looking forward to grade 8 because nobody would be able to beat him anymore. He had taken grade 4 and grade 5 in 1 year and missed most of grade 7. Pete was needed to work on the farm, but he managed to finish grade 8. That was all the formal education Pete would get for the rest of his life.
Dad came home one day and explained to Mom that he had lost all his money. He had invested it in, I think today we say futures, in wheat and so forth at the elevator. And he'd lost all his money. And Mother took him into the living room, and they were in there for a couple of hours praying and asking for forgiveness, because to the Mennonite brethren, it was wrong to invest in any stocks and that kind of thing. We did everything on the land, and the Lord blessed us or he didn't. We did not rely on people.
The Friesens moved to Yarrow, British Columbia. But Dietrich was still the same angry man he was when he came from Russia, and his temper was just as bad as ever. One day, when Pete was working in the newly wired barn, Dietrich had one of his usual temper tantrums and took a swing at Pete.
Hast du das aufgeräumt, ehe du es gegossen hast?
You will never hit me again.
Pete walked away, and Dietrich knew that the waters were level now, and his bullying had come to an end. The surprising thing is that Pete never hit Dietrich. He could have cleaned his clock, and when you think of all those beatings, and the hatred that some people experience, and how they get revenge when they can. But not Pete. He understood that it was his father's problem, and not his. Actually, it's kind of weird when you think of Mennonites as non-violent Christian people, and yet the father Dietrich, so violent to his own son, and the child understands the father's problem, and not the other way around as it should be. Actually, it's kind of cool. Kids are smart. So Pete worked on Dietrich's farm until World War II broke out.
As Mennonites, we were conscientious objectors. We do not take a life under any circumstances. We will go to the front lines. We will do anything that anybody else will as far as danger is concerned. But we will kill no man.
This meant that he would help with the military war effort, but he would not bear arms. He worked in forestry, built railways, and even got a chance to steer a big cargo ship. But what Pete really wanted was to be a paratrooper with the medical corps. This meant that he could jump out of airplanes and be with the soldiers in the front lines. He applied to do this, but the Army decided that they needed him to look after military records and sent him to St. John, New Brunswick in eastern Canada. This is where Pete first arrived when he was landed in Canada. He was back where he had started from. Pete was 21 now. So was Edith Markham, who was also a little baby when Pete first arrived in St. John. Edith played piano for the Soldiers and Airmen's Christian Association. Pete was told not to have anything to do with any religious group except Mennonites by some Mennonite ministers. This meant nothing to Pete when he met a group of Christians that believed in the basic truths taught by Jesus. Pete was a Mennonite, but he believed that God was larger than any church, including his own. So Pete joined the Soldiers and Airmen's Christian Association.
As Christian boys, we went to the Soldiers Airmen's Christian Association, and she was pianist there. And on her way home one day, some soldier followed her, and there were three of us that decided that we would walk her home. Well, of the three, she asked me more often than any of the others, and in 3 months' time we were married.
Edith was a Christian and belonged to the Anglican Church. Marrying outside of the Mennonite Church was a no in 1945. Pete thought nothing of this. But some people in his church thought otherwise. Before he was discharged, the military provided 2 months of schooling to help military personnel who were getting back into a civilian life.
The final question was, when you get out, what will be your motto for life? And I thought about it, and I came up with a motto that if a door of opportunity opens, I will always walk through it.
And so, he was honorably discharged from the military, and he and Edith went back to his Mennonite community in Yarrow, British Columbia. The people in Pete's Mennonite church did not like the idea of having Edith in their midst. She was not a Mennonite, and some of the deacons and ministers schemed together and made Pete and Edith leave the church.
I couldn't understand the Mennonites. I do now, but I didn't then. How they could be so closed not to allow anybody else in. They were really mad at Pete that he married outside the Mennonite church.
These people were only pretending to follow the teachings of Jesus. Pete and Edith just found another church where they felt that the teachings of Jesus were actually being practiced. Anyway, Pete bought a 40-acre farm. It was a dairy farm, and after a while, Pete decided to sell his cows. He was going to grow various crops that suited the rich soil around Yarrow. For the first little while, he was doing very well and starting to make good money. But things started to change. He planted berries, but his European market dried up. Then he tried beets and turnips, but that year Yarrow was flooded and all the crops were destroyed. That was enough for Pete. Somebody was telling him he was not meant to be a farmer.
How fate works, I don't know. How the good Lord works, it's beyond me.
Because of his days in the military, Pete was able to buy a chainsaw. Pete's neighbor had a small house moving business, and he really wanted that chainsaw. So he offered Pete to trade the house moving business for the chainsaw. The door of opportunity opened, and Pete walked through.
After the first house, that was in April approximately, March or April, then we moved that first house. Then we had the flood in June. The Fraser River overflowed its banks. And then we had a whole lot of houses to move. We moved them in Sardis, we moved them in Hatzick, and all up and down the river. And as I look back on it, I guess our prices were so low that none of the house movers got any of the jobs. We got them all.
Suddenly, there were hundreds of houses that needed to be moved. At first, he started off with a few screw jacks and wooden blocks and beams to lift and transport the houses. Then, he bought more hydraulic jacks, steel beams, cribs, and hired quite a few men as he began to get bigger. By the time he left his failed farming enterprise, his house moving business was big enough to support his family. And he moved to the Vancouver, British Columbia area from Yarrow and started to really build up his business. But Pete was not satisfied with the slow pace and was frustrated with the art and engineering methods of moving buildings. Crawling underneath the buildings and pumping up the hydraulic jacks by hand, often in mud or water, making progress very slow and miserable.
I crawled out, and they were making fun of me being so slow. I said, look guys, next year we're going to have a jacking outfit that's going to do the jacking automatically, hydraulically, and everything will come up at once. Hey, they laughed at me and joked. Big thing, yeah. Well, of course, that made me more determined.
So Pete drew up the plans for his new invention, patented the plans, and built the world's first unified hydraulic jacking system.
What we have here is a manifold, and these lines at this stage or point come from our unified pumping system outside the building. So they feed to each section of each main beam, which we have 4 main beams or 4 lines of jacks throughout the building hooked to a unified machine. What the unified machine means that if one corner is 10 tons lighter than the other corner, it will pick up the same amount, the same distance, no matter what the load. In other words, we have 50 ton and 90 ton. It will pick both at the same speed, same height at the same time.
About 99% of the house movers use the unified system as I designed it.
It was a natural progression for Pete to move into the house building business, especially prefabricated houses, because he had moved many of them north up the coast of British Columbia and saw there was a great need for such housing in remote areas of the big province.
I took it that I was to build houses from here on out. And that's what I did. I took that building and I built the factory. And we built it in such a way that we produced a house a day. It was a booming business.
Then, in 1967, the great city of Montreal in the province of Quebec needed 4,000 living spaces for all the visitors coming to the great Expo 67. They were behind in their preparations and building and desperately needed housing for the tens of thousands of visitors coming from all over the world. A contractor in Montreal contracted with Pete to build 4,000 prefab living units. Pete had hit the jackpot and designed one of the most effective prefab manufacturing plants ever built. The plant was producing 48 prefab units a day with only 57 employees. Pete would be able to deliver all 4,000 living units before the opening of the World Exhibition. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation were so interested in what and how Pete was doing this in British Columbia that they televised it right across Canada. Well, the government of Quebec saw the televised story and they gave Pete a phone call. They got right to the point. You are manufacturing buildings in British Columbia that will be used in Quebec. And the Quebec government wants 51% of your company. Pete couldn't believe his ears. Pete tried to reason with the government, but he got nowhere.
That was the government of Quebec that gave me that deal. And I refused it. I could not see it work. And I knew they had to have the housing. Well, they did not back down, and I did not back down. So I went into bankruptcy. I lost it all. Everything I lost except my rifles, my briefcase, my watch, and my camera. That's what I had left.
Edith took the children to stay with relatives in Vancouver, and Pete ended up sleeping on the concrete floor of a friend's garage. Pete had nothing.
And then that night a call came from Chicago. They made me an offer that I could not refuse.
Building Engineering Corporation in Chicago had a problem. They wanted to move a lot of old, historic buildings in and around the city of Chicago, and needed someone who could move these fragile structures without destroying or damaging them. After searching the whole United States, they concluded the inventor of the unified hydraulic jacking system would be their ideal choice. They called Pete and offered him a lot of money and United States residency status if he would come to Chicago and supervise the structural moving division of building engineering. So Pete moved to Chicago and started moving some of the most important historic buildings in the United States. Historic buildings are often in the way of modern cities as they develop and change. Today, we recognize the value of preserving our heritage. Government, private corporations, and citizens spend a lot of time and money trying to save as much as we can so that our children will see these beautiful old structures that are part of us, part of our past. Now Pete was called into the center of this quest to preserve history. Most historic buildings in all countries of the world are made of brick, stone, and mortar. This presents special difficulties when moving these buildings. In order to move a building, it has to be lifted up. It has to be cut away from the foundation on which it rests. And then enough pressure must be applied to the bottom of the building to overcome its total weight. This pressure can be applied with Pete's unified hydraulic jacking system, so that each individual jack puts enough pressure on the area of the building that it is lifting. At the point when the building starts to move up, the pressure of the jacks is transferred right through the building up to the very top stone or brick of that building. This stage is called initial inertia.
Yeah, we're starting to get separation right now. Keep it going. Tell me when you get to 99.45.
Okay, you got it.
You got it. Okay, you got it.
The top of a building must move at the same time as the bottom, or else the building will crumble and shatter like glass. Pete and Edith set up their new home in Chicago, and Pete started to move historic buildings. These buildings were larger, heavier, and more fragile than anything Pete had tried to move before. Any mistakes by miscalculation of pressure, placement of hydraulic jacks, or estimating the weight of the buildings or different sections of the building could easily cause the structure to crack and crumble, or even be completely destroyed. These were irreplaceable structures of invaluable worth.
A lot of engineers go to engineering school and come out and they can analyze things, but you give them a problem to design. Take a young engineer and ask him to design something. They'll just look at you. They don't know where to start. They have no ideas. They have no ideas. Pete, on the other hand, has lots of ideas.
Now, all the work and knowledge he had acquired over the years was being put to the test. He had learned to think things through, Der Denche, and had learned to visualize every move before he made it. Now, he faced a greater challenge. A challenge he could not solve by mathematical calculation or overcome by visualization. He had not spent much time with his family.
And I'd come home from work, and I'd be running out to do church work. Hardly had time to eat, no time for the family. And I felt so bad, I said, I would never do that again. I'll spend my time with my family.
He and Edith were losing their two oldest boys, Peter and Paul, to the world of drugs. Two beautiful young men with healthy minds and bodies were buried within a few years of each other, and Pete and Edith had their hearts broken. Of all the challenges in their lives, this dark chapter was by far the heaviest to carry. Pete and Edith's other three children all survived Peter and Paul, but they all missed their brothers. A certain emptiness that is there forever. In 1871, Chicago was almost completely destroyed by fire. The Widow Clark house is one of the only houses to have survived the fire, and today it is the oldest house in Chicago, and Pete was asked to move it. Moving a house, or really a mansion, like the Widow Clark house in the center of Chicago, is difficult enough. But Pete had to move it over the 27-foot elevated railway that runs through the city.
Move a lot of houses?
I'd say about between 3,000 and 4,000.
Wow. Is this any different from any other?
Well, I guess with going over the tracks, we don't do that every day.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So the elevated railway was stopped for the first time in history so that Pete could get his building across the 27-foot high elevated railway commuter line. 27 feet up and 27 feet down, and Pete was on his way. The Widow Clark house is now sitting where Pete placed it. It is being fully restored and has a beautiful setting in the center of Chicago.
That year with Beldings, I had a deal where I got so much wage and a certain percentage of the profits. And the profits were enough that I could buy the company. About a year later, we got a job, the fire station.
It is all brick, stands 2 stories high, weighs 1,400,000 pounds.
The city decided to save the building, I'm sure for historical reasons, because it was built back in the 20s. So it was moved down the hill probably about 100 yards, maybe a little more. And the kids in town can go down there and play video games. As it first started out as video games and some pool tables, and then it grew into other activities that they do nowadays.
For this move, Pete set his first Guinness Book of Records for the heaviest building moved on rails and rollers. Of course, like many other struggles in his career, Pete's partner argued against moving it with the 3-point loading method, saying that it wouldn't work. Well, it did work. The fire hall was turned into a youth center, which for Pete was the greatest reward of all. Pete always cherishes the children who will become the leaders of the world tomorrow. He also moved the Oneida Stake Academy for the Mormon Church, which gave Pete a great sense of satisfaction for preserving for the students a permanent piece of their history.
Lindsay, moving and rigging, was called upon to relocate the building and work for the Friends of the Academy was the client there. That building had to be moved 6 blocks to a new location that was donated to the Academy to set it up and renovate it. It stood in the way of the current high school for expansion, and they wanted to preserve the building and save it. It was one of the oldest schools in the state. I'm not going to say that I wouldn't have been able to do it without Pete, but I'll tell you, I'd probably still be there right now trying to accomplish that job out there. That was something that he engineered, as he has in past large projects with me, that he's got all the answers all the time. So it was one of those things. It's like a security blanket that I can take to these projects with me and have him there and use his motto is think it through. And I found myself thinking way harder than I wanted to think it through, and he's just a phone call away, and it's always saved me lots of hours of thinking it through. He helps think it through with me.
This whole project is very spiritual to me. There's no way it would be sitting here if we had not had help, and I believe Pete Friesen was part of that help.
He has given me so much enlightenment with moving buildings and life in general. One of his main sayings told me when I first met him. As a matter of fact, I think that's when he was trying to con me into maybe coming to work. And it was, Del, if the door's open, walk through.
The beautiful historic city of Lafayette, Indiana, was touched by Pete when he designed the move for the beautiful 19th century train station. Today, the station is fully operational and is part of the historic fabric of this colorful historic city, thanks to Pete. Pete's next Guinness Book of Records was in 1986, moving the old Fairmount Hotel in San Antonio, Texas. The heaviest structure to be moved on wheels. The building weighed 3.5 million pounds, and Pete moved it 5 city blocks through San Antonio. Today, the Fairmount Hotel is one of the most beautiful historic landmarks in Texas, thanks to Pete.
The owners had a deadline when the building had to be off. The owners of the hotel, of the building that we were moving, were very, very upset about it. They knew that the way it was going, it could not be done. So one of the owners came to me and said, Pete, could you move it if you were in charge? I said, yes, I could. So he said, well, we'll see that you get in charge. Well, it wasn't that simple because I was consultant and not superintendent. I would have to take over off of men that were there that were belonging to the company. And we talked to Mr. Emmert about this. He didn't go along with it at all willingly, but it was a matter of either the place gets torn down or I become the superintendent.
We'll make the first pull from where they are because it'll only take about 10 feet and it'll be around. See, and then you start pointing the first ones around. You take that end truck off and bring it around to this side and hook Brutus onto it. And Brutus will pull from over here to help this corner get around.
He went along with it. I become the superintendent. We told the men that were there, and the whole crew quit, except one man. We had a couple of men from my people in in Chicago, and I hired a bunch of Mexican immigrants. There was a fellow came around and he said that he had access to the immigrants. And it was funny, you know, you'd see the immigration officer come around, and all of a sudden you had no employees. They had all gone, disappeared someplace.
We've been working now for 3 weeks, night after night until 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4:30. So to get a couple hours off is just great.
We got the building loaded. And in time, day of the move came. We had everything ready, and the employees from Emmert showed out to help with the move. We just got started a little bit, and I went to Mr. Emmert and said, yeah, that fellow that was superintendent here before, he's here. He's here to cause nothing but problems from what I see, and I want you to ship him back home. Well, no, we didn't want to. I said, okay, I go home. Plain as that. And he shipped him home.
I keep sweeping the curb, but see, I'm supposed to be coming, my schedule calls for me to come right in through here, through the arc.
Someone tried to take most of the credit for this move in a story written in the International Association of Structural Movers magazine. The owner of the hotel, Thomas Wright, knew better and wrote this letter to the president of the International Association of Structural Movers. Pete Friesen was the mastermind behind the entire move. Without Pete's expertise, tenacious dedication, and untiring effort, the move would never have been accomplished.
Oh, I think it's great. It really is wonderful to see. I really am enjoying looking at this.
It's really something. I'll tell you, something like we've never seen before. Something we'll probably never see again in this part of the country. I got put into the House Movers Association, into the board of directors, why they gave me the job of being the awards chairman. Well, I thought after the moving to Fairmont that Pete certainly deserved the Hall of Fame award.
The International Association of Structural Movers is composed of fellow house movers. They got together at a meeting and decided that they would give me this award. He spent a lifetime doing the impossible and made it possible for others to do likewise. And that is very precious to me.
During the 1990s, Pete set 2 more Guinness Book of World Records. In fact, he broke his own record in the same year. In 1997, the Gem Theater in Detroit, Michigan, was facing the wrecking ball because it was in the way of the new Ford Stadium to be built in the center of Detroit. This theater was built in 1903 and was really valued by many theatergoers. The famous actor, George C. Scott, performed there quite often early in his career. It was a difficult move, and the building might have been lost if it weren't for Pete.
We had movers from all over the country, and some of the movers were outspoken, and one of them told me I was stupid and didn't know what I was doing. until I did what I intended to do, and he came and apologized. He said, I never thought that that would work. We had Ford Engineering Company, and the head man from Ford came and talked to me several times, and he said, Pete, we just felt that that job could not be done. It could not be engineered to work. And here you are doing it.
So Pete had achieved another Guinness Book of World Records for heaviest building moved, at 5,400,000 pounds for moving the heaviest building on wheels. Then, Pete went to Minneapolis and moved the Schubert Theater, a very fragile, difficult building to move. Because not only was it brick, but different sections of the building had extreme differences in weight. Another Guinness Book of World Records for the heaviest building moved on wheels, at almost 6 million pounds. So Pete broke his own Guinness Book of World Records in the same year.
We, International Chimney, we worked with Pete Friesen on the Schubert Theater. This was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And unfortunately, the project went through the worst part of the winter, where it was extremely cold as opposed to in the summer. But yeah, certainly Pete was instrumental in helping us make that project work. Pete was there to offer some help because it was so cold when we were actually moving the building that some of the dollies started to fail. Through the whole thing, Pete was able to walk us through it, help us solve the problems, and make the whole project work, and it came off amazingly well.
The Newark, New Jersey International Airport is rich in aviation history. It served the New York area since 1928, and for a decade was the busiest airport in the world. It had the first paved runways, first lights for night flying, first air traffic control tower, first weather station, and first airport post office. Charles Lindbergh, Howard Hughes, and Eddie Rickenbacker are all part of this airport's rich history. This Newark Air Terminal building was the first commercial air terminal in the world and was dedicated by the famous pilot Amelia Earhart in 1935 and moved by Pete in 2000. The whole building, 280 feet long, 70 feet wide, and 2 stories high, plus the control tower, all 13 million pounds, using 167 rubber tire dollies with 1,312 wheels.
Right, 103 feet, right on the money.
When Pete and Jerry Matiko of Expert House Movers, one of Pete's moving team members, were standing on the roof of the building sizing up the job, Jerry turned to Pete and simply said, "Pete, it's too big." Pete replied, "Jerry, think of it as a small job that needs more equipment to do it."
Because sometimes Pete could get pretty hard. He's sort of like Superman. You got Clark Kent, the mild-mannered reporter. Then when he gets out there on the job, it's, "Come on, guys, let's go." And he'd push you. And I'm sure he would have been pretty rough to work with when he was a little bit younger. I started working with him, I think he was in his 60s.
Pete visualized the job from beginning to end, which was close to a mile from one end of the airport to the other. Pete's work, helping preserve our history by moving buildings to places where they would be safe and could be enjoyed by all of us far into the future, prepared him for his next challenge. No one knows when lights on the shore were first used to guide ships at sea. Before the birth of Christ, in 280 BC, the Egyptians built a 450-foot tall tower on the island of Pharos, close to the port city of Alexandria. There were 18 lighthouses built all along the shores of Europe to help guide ships safely to shore. So when the Europeans came to North America, they built lighthouses along the eastern seaboard to protect their ships when they came into harbor. Before the lighthouses were built, there were thousands of shipwrecks where the wild Atlantic Ocean met the eastern shores of North America. When sailors saw the lighthouses, they knew where they were and avoided the treacherous shoals and dangerous rocks and cliffs along the eastern seaboard. Lighthouses were the only navigational tools available in those early times, and lighthouse keepers were hired to operate these lighthouses and live there with their families. These lighthouses were tended to around the clock. Today, satellites have replaced lighthouses as instruments of navigation, but thousands of people wanted to save the lighthouses for their historical and cultural value. These beacons of light have become more than life-saving guides for sailors and their ships. The lighthouses are beautiful and different in their structure and style. They came to be loved by millions of North Americans.
In 1880, Lippincott's magazine reported the fact that the local island farmers who farmed here along the southern coast of Block Island warned the federal agents who were building the lighthouse and cautioned them against putting the lighthouse exactly where they did, because these farmers knew fair well that they had to move their fences back several feet every year or so to compensate for the steady erosion.
The 4 million pound Southeast Lighthouse on Rhode Island, built in 1873, was threatened by the sea and had to be moved. Jerry Abbott spearheaded the work to save the Southeast Lighthouse and represents the thousands of people who worked so hard to save the light.
I raised the idea at a meeting of the Historical Society Board of Directors in 1983, and it seemed to me that if we didn't do something to try to save the lighthouse, if we saw it fall into the sea, we'd feel very remiss and irresponsible. And here we are today, 10 years later, after 3 acts of Congress and a lot of generous donations and hard work.
Jim Morocco of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the supervising engineer in charge of construction for the Northeast United States, and the Southeast Lighthouse was under his control. Here is Jim Morocco describing his dream team.
Pete was the brains behind it. He had the concept of how it was going to be moved. He had this ideas in his head to do something that had never been done before, which other people don't always have that foresight. It's easy, once it's been done, how to do it. But he had the insight at front. Now, he was there as a consultant. The Mattico brothers were doing the actual physical labor, and Pete was leading the symphony, and he was the conductor. And International Chimney was the ones that put it all together. They did all the shop drawings, and they had the engineering background, and they were the general contractor and the money people. But Pete was kind of the concept and the brain behind the thing, and he's that hidden that you didn't see every day in the movement, but he was the constant. He was always thinking how things were going to get done, how we could do this work.
Well, I came to the lighthouse, and they took me into the office, something I'd never seen before. The whole office rose when I came in. I was just totally stunned. Never seen such a thing before. We got on with the move, and later on I found out that other movers had been there in the town and talking about this job. There is just no way in the world that the two can be moved together. That is an absolute impossibility.
These buildings, lighthouses, buildings, they're all unique, and they all have their own little quirks about them. You need somebody on site that has an eye for these structures, how they're going to act. You need somebody that has that experience on the site. There's nobody better in my mind than Pete.
This move with the 2 buildings separate, a concentrated load for the tower
a spread out load for the house presents special problems, especially where we only have a walkway connecting the two. So we're really trying real hard to make this thing hold together. And it's, well, to me it's a real art to do this, because brick in itself has but very little strength.
The interesting thing, like when Block Island Lighthouse was being moved, it had never been done. And most people didn't think it could be done. And if you read a lot of the newspaper accounts, there was just as many people betting it was going to fall as it was going to make it. And they actually had pools where you could put money in and pick a day to see what day it was going to collapse. And if it collapsed that day, you'd get whatever was in the pool of money. And luckily, it didn't fall, moved like a charm, and everything worked out beautifully.
The three-point loading system, if you can imagine a tricycle. 3 points on the ground, you can go over rough ground and so forth. It just gives with the ground. We chose the zigzag pattern for the simple reason that it's a natural way to move. If we went on the diagonal, we would have had corners that had very little load. We'd have had the center, which had very much load. And because we were trying to create no damage to the building.
The one thing that strikes me to this day, the one thing I'll say if anybody asks me about this, is he's just like the consummate gentleman. He is a gentle soul and a kind guy. He's much more concerned about the thoughts and concepts and other people's feelings than he is about the business end of the deal. He's more concerned about the aesthetics of things and the beauty of things than he is obviously about the business end of the deal. And he was just a joy to work with. He never thought of himself. He always thought of like bettering other people by imparting his knowledge, that he was secure in himself enough that if other people knew what he knew, it wouldn't be any detriment to him, but would actually benefit him.
The head engineer came to see me. Pete, he said, I want to talk to you. And, well, what's this all about? Well, he said, what it's about. We paid $300,000 to have you on this job, and we understand that you are getting nowhere near that amount. Well, I said, I get 10% of what the mover gets. That's my deal. Well, that's not enough. We paid so much, and this was way less. He said, after this, remember what you are worth. And that year, we won the highest award from the Corps of Engineers, the top engineering job. And they were just very, very pleased with the way that we moved that house.
So Pete moved the 4 million pound lighthouse 300 feet on rails and rollers and placed the building on its new site within 1/4 of an inch of his original calculation. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers awarded Pete and his team the top engineering job of 1993. All the experts who said it couldn't be done were not heard from again. Of course, with Pete, this didn't make any difference. He kept his vision and der Denke thought it through. I'm happy to say that I was part of the team that accomplished this monumental task. It was a joy to work with Pete and have him mentor myself and my fellow engineers. I hope I have the good fortune to have our paths cross in the near future. Sincerely, Jane Zay Morocco, Resident Engineer, New England Division, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. 2 more lighthouses were in danger of being swallowed by the sea. The Highland Light and the Nauset Lighthouse on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Once again, Pete and his team come to the rescue and move both lighthouses before they fall over the cliff, saving 2 precious pieces of history.
I always describe the Block Island Lighthouse as a gentle old woman, and this lady is a little bit cantankerous sometimes. Well, just little things go wrong here and there. Nothing serious, but this one wants more attention than Block Island did. There's a lot to history. Now, when I was younger, I felt different about history. I used to say, away with the old. bring on the new. Today I feel a little bit different, I guess maybe because I'm older. When I first came here, I drove around along Route 6. And I thought about the pilgrims from way back when. I was totally overwhelmed with the thought of it. So I'm grateful to have been able to be on this job.
Pete uses his unified hydraulic jacking system with 3-point loading and rails and rollers to move the Highland light to a safe site, and moves the lighter steel Nauset tower with a lowboy truck and tractor.
It was very clear from the beginning that the fastest way that this was going to actually come about was if a private nonprofit organization started from grassroots effort, and that's exactly what happened.
By now, Pete and his team are the only experts in the world at moving lighthouses. When the need came to save one more lighthouse, Pete's team was called on once more to achieve the impossible.
This is the lighthouse. This is the granddaddy of the lighthouses.
Cape Hatteras Lighthouse stands 208 feet high, or about 20 stories tall. Weighs almost 10 million pounds. It has to be moved 3,000 feet, over half a mile.
Cape Hatteras was the most dangerous passage that mariners had in the United States, going up and down the coast and going down into the Caribbean and that's where they lost most of their shipping. So it was very important that they have a decent light.
The decision to move the lighthouse to this new site came after long, hard battles between the citizens living at Cape Hatteras and the authorities who didn't know what to do. Many people, including so-called expert engineers, were sure that the lighthouse would fall over if Pete and his team tried to move it. When the decision to move the light was finally made, Pete and his team took over and prepared the light for the move.
Cape Hatteras is an unsupported masonry lighthouse. In other words, there is no infrastructure to it. It's just bricks stacked up. So in that respect, it's the tallest unsupported masonry lighthouse in the world. It's also probably better known than almost any lighthouse. It's one of those lighthouses that the public can interact with. They can actually go there. Kids can climb this thing and they can see what it was like for some guy 100 years ago, 125 years ago, to climb these 200 and some steps carrying cans of oil to light that light.
As with all buildings, the foundation had to be separated from the tower so the light could be lifted. Pete and his team laid down the rails that would carry the light. Pete placed 100,000 pound jacks underneath the building, providing 20 million pounds of force to lift the 10 million pound building.
Okay, the lighthouse is up off the shoring. She's on our jacks.
This provided a safety factor of twice the weight required to lift the building. Pete thought some of the hydraulic jacks might fail, and he wanted lots of backup. As it turned out, 9 of the 100 jacks did fail. But it didn't matter, because of the large 50% safety factor Pete allowed for. Mike Booher is the author and photographer of a book on this historic move called Out of Harm's Way, written with Lynn Ezell, historian for NASA and curator of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum.
Early on, in very early February, there was nobody there, no tourists, etc., just the workmen. They're putting up fences, they're doing all, and this guy comes to the fence and he waves at me. I'm coming out of the trailer and I walk over and he says, "Are you with the people that are doing this?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I want you to know," he says, "I'm a retired engineer. So I've been retired for 15 or 16 years. He says, "Is that the lighthouse they're talking about moving?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, I'm going to tell you what." He says, "They'll never move it." And he went and got in his car and drove off.
George Gardner was still getting letters from many professors of engineering saying that what they were doing wouldn't work and that the building might fall down if they tried to move it. Pete paid no attention to all these people. He just carried on with his work. He had heard all this before.
I expected to get there without a murmur or a crack.
To me, I can't imagine moving it any other way. Although there were a lot of the people that came down there to see it moved that had interesting questions, and the press in some cases reported various things. For instance, sawing it in thirds and rolling it to the other end, or laying it down and moving it. I mean, and they were serious. They thought that's what was going to happen. They had no idea it was going to be moved in an upright position, which is the only way to move it.
At Hatteras, Pete had the idea that, every time on the push jacks, every time we push, we have to, 5 feet, we have to unbolt that push jack and re-bolt it, clamp it to the track steel. Every 5 feet. It's a good 15-minute operation with all those jacks. So he's talking to me and he said, why can't we do something hydraulically or with a can? So Pete would send me sketches and I'd send him sketches, and back and forth for about a week. And we came up with what we called a jack-in-a-box, which was we built a steel frame around the track steel and put a 100-ton jack in it. And we energized that jack, and that clamps the push jack to its anchor it. So every 5 foot of stroke that we push that lighthouse and reset the jacks, we saved about 10 minutes. That saved them, I'm guessing that saved Jerry maybe 2 or 3 weeks.
Pete stayed with what he knew was true. Used his imagination, got a clear vision of the whole job at hand, denke, thought it through and completed the job.
We have done it. We're going to throw our hats in the air and shout hooray.
Pete and his team all received the highest engineering award in the United States, the Opal Award for Outstanding Projects and Leaders, given out once a year by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Pete received this letter from Dr. Hampton, President of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Dear Mr. Friesen, no celebration of civil engineering's best and brightest would be complete without you.
You've known loss and sadness. You've drunk from sorrow's well. You've moved think it through. Every step of the way, every move that you make, every turn of the trail, every step that you take.